Hello, my name is Collin Grant, and I'm going to be discussing Dracula and vampires from scary to loving and how vampires are now used in children's content and media. I have taken a bit of inspiration from some of the vampires that we will be discussing today, though I wasn't able to grow in my fangs fast enough for the presentation. But I hope you enjoy. And I do want to say, while the slideshow is going to be important, what I'm saying is going to be more important as it has much more detail than the presentation itself. Firstly, I'll be going over Dracula and vampire traits, starting with Bram Stoker's Dracula, written in 1897. This vampire was blood-sucking. He had to drink blood to live. Often, he would look like a handsome man, but had very uncanny features, such as pale skin, fangs, or animal-like physical traits. Vampires were very narcissistic, violent creatures. They found no issue taking the lives of others to live. They would often lie to get exactly what they want, and they saw no issue with manipulating others. This vampire was very arrogant and manipulative. He was very sadistic and cruel. He had one trait that kept women coming around, which were those looks. Today's modern vampires and Dracula are depicted in a much different demeanor. These vampires now have the choice to drink blood. They don't have to live. These vampires often display as human rather than vile creatures. It becomes harder to distinguish what's a vampire and what's a human in newer works. They often will tell people to stay away as they don't want to hurt them because they are vampires. They also struggle with immortality, and they find themselves protecting others from prosecution in several works. This is a very brief timeline of vampire works that isn't super thorough, but it does kind of walk us towards our more modern day vampires. Starting with Nosferatu 1922, the Dracula film 1931, House of Dracula 1945, Count Dracula on Sesame Street in 1972, Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992, The Little Vampire 2000, Twilight 2008, and Hotel Transylvania in 2012. We saw a stark change in how Dracula was portrayed starting in the 1930s. We are shown Dracula in the 1931 film Dracula, which gives us a much more handsome and outgoing character rather than a dark, soulless character who just wants blood. While still a very dark character, we start to see a bit more emotion and physical attachment for others' lives. We slowly start to see a transition of Dracula and vampires to a more loving character in the 1960s. Here's a brief list of the vampire movies that have more of a darker take before the 1960s. Here's a list of some of the darker portrayals of vampires and Dracula in some of the works before 1960, starting with Nosferatu in 1922, Dracula in 1931, House of Dracula in the 1945 film, I Am Legend in the 1953 book, and Horror of Dracula in 1958. Count von Count, or Count Dracula, was introduced to Sesame Street in 1972. He carried many of the physical traits the original Count Dracula in 1897 had, that being skin so pale he was pink, he had sharp teeth, big ears, and overall looked a bit closer to an animal than a person. This version of Count Dracula had a much more joyous, less frightful approach than others. This is where we start to see Dracula introduced into children's culture, as well as a less frightful and less focused on blood vampire. Dracula then had a steady uprise of love than blood ever since Count von Count. We start to see an uprise in the combination of gothic culture and children's content, starting with the popularity of the show The Addams Family in 1964. While not considered vampires themselves, they hold many of the key characteristics such as pale skin, wealth, and neglect for others' lives. While it is not often spoken as to why we specifically love vampires or quirky families like the Addams Family, the reason that the underdog, anti-hero, and gothic characters are used is that we see ourselves in them. And psychologists agree. The underdog story is also deeply rooted in the American dream, economically or socially. Moving up in the world is paramount in the context of American culture. It's not just where you wind up, but how far you've climbed to get there. Johnson, 2021. Even though the Addams Family aren't what we call great people, we still want to see them succeed as they represent the American dream. People want to see success as so much sadness had happened during World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and the Great Depression. People didn't care that they were different. We all have our quirks and we can relate to them in some way. This has transpired down to vampires and how they are viewed today. We do not see them as scary, misunderstood monsters, but rather an anti-hero we can support. Why are vampires used in children's content? While this is my own idea as to why vampires are used in these stories, my theory is that escapism may be the leading cause as to why vampires have been adopted into children's media. Vampires can offer another world view to children and take them from the real world and place them in a world where death doesn't exist, and even the worst people have feelings. How did vampires make it into children's content? Well, starting in 1931, the film Dracula, it allowed for a love interest to take place, such as becoming less violent and wanting to spend more time with a loved one than sucking blood. And because vampires are immortal, this makes the character timeless, as vampires have slowly become less violent, such that they now focus on love and look a lot less scary than they once did, and they want to care for others. Vampires have changed. We don't associate vampires with something scary, but rather as romantic figures who aren't violent. Because of these changes and how vampires are portrayed, we don't bat an eye when they're used in children's content today. Some of that content being Dracula, Vampirina, The Little Vampire, Hotel Transylvania. These are all works that children or preteens watch that we don't bat an eye when someone watches them. There's no violence. There may be in Twilight, but that's for your preteen audience. While there are so many reasons as to why Dracula and vampires have changed throughout time, we see the characters change most during times of crisis, whether that's financial issues, political issues, disease, or war. We can see on this very brief timeline I've created that vampires have changed through different historical events. In the 1930s, America was experiencing the Great Depression. People wanted to see someone happy and rich. They wanted escapism. They wanted to leave their own life. In the 1970s, many activist movements were happening, as well as the Vietnam War. This may be why Count Von Count was focused more on learning and love than blood-sucking. The Vietnam War had made people rethink, what were we doing? They didn't want violence. They wanted to learn and prosper. Why and how did vampires become a character that is often used in children's stories? Vampires have the ability to represent far more than a monster. They can represent misfits and outcasts. They can show that even if you're in a bad situation, you don't have to be bad. You can choose kindness and choose love over violence. They also show that even if you look different or act different, it doesn't matter. It teaches to embrace your unique abilities. Vampires, they represent all of us. That's why they're used in children's content. How vampires in modern works display after what we've learned. I'm going to briefly discuss two films, that being The Little Vampire 2000 and Hotel Transylvania 2012. I selected The Little Vampire because during the early 2000s, vampire media became massive, and this movie kicked that off. I also chose Hotel Transylvania as it's a very successful, well-known franchise that came towards the end of the vampire craze of the early 2000s. In The Little Vampire, our main character, Rudolph, who's a vampire who struggles to fit in with society. He shows that just because he's a vampire doesn't make him any less human. While our side character, Tony, tries to help him figure out how to become a human, the true meaning of the story displays that it doesn't matter who you are, it's what you do while you're alive, and that everyone, even misfits, can be accepted. This shows that vampires have changed by pulling from the dark and scarier stories of Dracula. We can create a story that teaches morals to children. Hotel Transylvania 2012 depicts a Dracula that carries many of the physical traits of the 1931 Dracula. This Dracula also dresses in fancy suits and has black, slicked back hair with fangs, as well as lives in a castle. Though these are the only similarity between the two. The morals this Dracula holds are far better. This Dracula displays the idea that we must put others before ourselves. This is displayed in his castle, which protects other monsters. He also displays learning and forgiveness. Dracula thought humans wanted to kill monsters, but monsters have changed into a hero humans love and admire. Overall, by using Dracula and vampires, many morals of acceptance, change, and friendship can be learned. Overall, this is a brief analysis of how Dracula and vampire lore has been transformed into a media product for children. This is the end of the presentation, but I do hope you enjoyed it. When we first started this class, I was very curious as to how 1931 Dracula became Dracula in Hotel Transylvania, which is one of my favorite films to watch every year at Halloween time ever since it came out. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed. It was a lot of fun making this presentation and doing all this research. Thank you. Have a great day.